tonight, and we are going to have Dr. Michael Newton-Keas, a friend of mine, as our speaker. We're very excited to have him here. He's recently authored this book called Unbelievable: 7 Myths About the History and Future of Science and Religion. And I know a bit about Mike's work because I have known him for a while, and in fact I filled in for him when he's on sabbatical as a professor teaching his material, so I had to get in depth with a lot of the historical evidence and came to have a great appreciation for his work and his research and just think the world of him. And I think this is an important message because I know for me, studying physics at UT Austin and other places, you often encounter people who think that there's this long history of Christianity opposing science. And that's a big reason that they don't tend to even, consider the question of, is intelligent design evidence out there? They just kind of dismiss it and think that these religious people are opposing science, when really that these are based on factually incorrect understanding of history. And so Mike, Dr. Keas here, he's been really researching this for 25 years. It's been the main focus of his career, and it's finally culminating in this wonderful book. And so I hope you'll buy the book on Amazon, or I've actually bought a few copies that I would like to give away. We're not allowed to sell it here at the university, but if you are a student here, if you're not a student, you probably have a job and you can go buy one on Amazon. If you're a student here, I want to make this available for free to you. If you come up to me afterwards, if you're one of the first ones, and you'll actually read the book, I'll just be happy to give you a copy if you promise to read it. So talk to me afterwards, and we'll give away some books. And also, let me tell just a little bit more about Dr. Keas' background. He has a PhD from Oklahoma University. Woo! So some of y'all like that, some of y'all maybe don't like that if you're from UT Austin like me, but it's a great school. He also has, he's gotten a research grant from the National Science Foundation. He's been a professor at Biola University, which I did some graduate study there, and I remember the first time I ever heard of Dr. Keas was from a fellow student who was like, you wouldn't believe this class. He just found it interesting to hear the story about Galileo, for example, just set straight about what really happened. No, he didn't go to jail and all these things. And so I've always thought a lot about his work over the years. So we're really glad for the first time ever to have him come to UT Dallas and give this talk. And so join me in welcoming him up here. Thanks a lot. Great idea.
Yeah, it's great to be back in the classroom. I taught for a quarter century. College students, love students, but now I'm a full-time author, so I have to actually travel to find students, so thank you for coming out tonight. Yeah. So, yes, it's time to go public with these myths. Indeed, scientists, do you think scientists actually believe in myths? Unfortunately, a lot of them do, and I've written a book about it. And scientific communicators, like the world's leading one, Tyson, perpetuates most of the myths that I'm debunking. Here's the first one. The myth says, a big universe is a problem for Christianity. Counts against it. And Bill Nye's great for expressing this. He says, I'm significant. I'm just another speck of sand. And the Earth, really, in the cosmic scheme of things, is another speck. And the Sun, an unremarkable star. And the galaxy is a speck. I'm a speck on a speck, orbiting a speck, among still other specks, among still specks in the middle of specklessness. I suck! Okay, but then he goes on in this speech to the Humanist Society, where he was getting the Humanist of the Year award, and says, well, look, the audience was laughing with him because they really knew what he meant, which is religion sucks, or the religious basis for human significance sucks. Because how could, God pay attention to us little tiny speck, But he goes on to say, and yet we are significant. And he proposes the fact that, or he proposes the story that because we evolve these brains over long periods of time, and we've discovered how big the universe is, that makes us significant. Well, according to this view that a big universe is a problem for the Judeo-Christian perspective, ancient people also who were religious thought the universe was small, according to this story. But you look at ancient Hebrew literature and you'll find that's not the case. right? When you look at this psalm, does it sound like this psalmist thought the universe was big or small? What do you think? Yeah, because he's using the universe as a picture to show you how great who is? God, right? So there's this analogy. Okay, so clearly in the background is the idea the universe is really big. How about an ancient Greek scientist, Ptolemy, the greatest astronomer of the ancient world? He said that the Earth has, to the senses, the ratio of a point to the distance of the so-called fixed stars. That is, they thought the stars were all on one big globe with the Earth in the middle, and the Earth was considered to be so small, and he had a good argument for it. This is just the conclusion, that the Earth was so small that it was like virtually dimensionless, which is what a mathematical point is, right? Virtually dimensionless. And now we fast forward, so we went from ancient Hebrew to late ancient Greek, now to early modern. We're a 17th century quote here from Johannes Kepler. And he was actually confronting the very myth that I debunk in the book. He says, according to this same argument, and then I'm interpolating here given the context, that is, he was talking about the argument that humans are unimportant because the universe is so big. He says, according to this argument, man would still be insignificant in a small cosmos because he can in no way be compared with the size of Earth. In other words, any one human body, or even all the human bodies that have ever lived, compared to the mass of the Earth, it's very tiny, right, compared to the size of the Earth. So regardless of how big the universe is, we could still be, if the universe were only like 3 Earth radii out and that was it, although that would be a problem. How would you get the sun in there and the moon? But anyway, if the universe were really, really small, you could, surely atheists could come up with, well, look how small we are compared to this huge planet. See how insignificant we are. That was Kepler's point. Okay. Now, C.S. Lewis took this a step further. So now we're fast forwarding to just our 20th century. And the way he explains this, he says, well, look, the way humans normally perceive space, we perceive it, of course, in 3 dimensions. And according to our imaginations, it's hard to really conceive of boundaries to space. We just feel as if space goes on and on and on. Now, this is how we imagine space, or how we feel about it. This is not necessarily a scientific perspective. But there were pre-modern, that is ancient and medieval, Greeks, Jews, and Christians who did imagine the universe this way, and it got into the poetry, which I showed you earlier. And also, as we get into from Ptolemy on, clearly, there are scientific theories that underwrote this idea of a huge universe. It actually gave us good reasons to believe it, not just that we imagine it that way. So the idea of the myth is that, well, pre-modern religious people, they thought the universe was small. But when modern scientists discovered the hugeness of the universe, then that counted against religion. That's the way the story goes. So there's a sort of a historical framework for the story, but when you look at the real history, it just doesn't fit, because pre-modern religious people, whether they were scientists or not, believed the universe was really big. And then, of course, as you add the science to it, they had even further justification for that. So Lewis then goes and walks through the different options. So let's suppose there were no objects visible except for the sun and the moon. In other words, it looked like the universe was just Earth, the sun, and the moon. That's it. Okay? Let's just pretend that was the case. Then, as Lewis explains, then, there's the quote, then this vast emptiness would certainly be used as a strong argument against the existence of God. In other words, atheists would say something like, given that we imagine space going on and on and on, right? Well, what God would create vast amounts of empty space with nothing in it, you see? So therefore, this God doesn't exist, right? And then Lewis goes and runs through other options. Well, suppose we do find objects out there beyond the sun and moon, which, of course, we do. I'm sure you know that, right? Okay, we do, okay? So, and Lewis writes, then there's 2 options. He's just kind of running through the flow chart here, right? 2 options. Either those objects out there there's a lot of habitable ones, or maybe they're largely uninhabitable. And Lewis says, and the odd thing is that both these hypotheses are used as grounds for rejecting Christianity. I mean, just think about it. If there turns out to be billions of habitable planets, well, then the atheist can say, well, see, humans aren't special. We're lost in a crowd of aliens, right? Well, what if it turns out that virtually none of the planets out there are habitable? That is, they're virtually all uninhabitable. Well, then the atheist could say, well, see, what self-respecting God would create trillions and trillions of sterile planets? What lousy design? I mean, any other complaints? I mean, no matter if God exists and if he made the universe, no matter how God made the universe, big, small, inhabited, uninhabited, whatever, except for Earth, people are going to find creative ways to, badmouth God, okay? It's kind of like you could think of creative ways to badmouth the sports team you don't like in Oklahoma or whatever, right? So, yeah. So, bottom line is, the myth, a big universe is a problem for Christianity, and modern science discovered it was big and, trashed religion. This myth doesn't stand up in the face of a couple of points. One, the ancient and medieval folks knew it was big. Whether they were theologians, poets, or scientists, they knew it was big. It's not a modern discovery. And furthermore, when you think about it, the God described in the Judeo-Christian tradition is a God of inconceivably great power, right? Infinite power and capabilities. Isn't it sort of fitting that he might make a universe that would reflect his glory? Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. Sounds like something you would expect. And then, of course, the real kicker is that atheists will find ways to deny God regardless of how big and what is in the universe. How big it is and its contents. So this really sounds more like game rigging, not truth seeking. So Lewis nicely lays out how this is just one big sentimental game. Okay. So by the way, if you like C.S. Lewis, whether you've just dipped into his fictional literature or whether you went into his apologetics, you'll like my book, because Lewis makes many cameo appearances in my book, okay? Yeah. Every time when you turn the corner, Lewis is there, right? It's like Alfred Hitchcock appearing in his movies, okay? Okay, here's another. We don't have time for all the myths, so I'm just sort of picking out some highlights, okay? That was myth 1. Myth 3 is that medieval Christians thought Earth was flat. Now, how many of you were taught that Europeans thought Earth was flat until Columbus came around and proved it was round in 1492? Raise your hand if you were taught that. Everybody, raise your hand if you were taught that. Yeah, vast majority. Okay, turns out that's not true, okay? So to make the point, let's rewind the tape of time. Let's go back to, let's say, the 12th, 13th century, where we have these new institutions called the university. And by the way, guess who invented the university? Christians did, okay? Which has been the longest sustained institutional support for science. So, yeah. So anyway, Christians invented this institution. And up until the time of Columbus, there had been hundreds of thousands of students in Europe who went through these institutions who learned arguments for a spherical Earth, among countless other scientific things. Because about a third of the curriculum was science. Can you imagine that? Regardless of what your major is, you walk into the university, about a third of what you did was math and science. Okay? Does that sound like the Dark Ages, so-called Dark Ages? That's myth number 2, by the way. The Dark Ages never happened, okay? But I skipped over that myth. So, all right, now, here's a test. You've got 30 seconds. Turn to someone next to you and give 1 or 2 reasons why you think the Earth is round rather than flat based on observations. Go. And we're going to pit you against medieval students. Okay, did you come up with this one? Did you come up with this one? That during a lunar eclipse, when the Earth's shadow is cast on the moon, you can see the edge of that shadow is curved. Okay? Or how about this one? As you travel north, Polaris, the North Star, which right now, which at this latitude is about 35 degrees up in the sky, as you travel further and further north, the North Star appears to be what? Higher or lower? Higher, right? And when you get to the North Pole, where does it appear? Right over your head, right? So now, medieval students didn't have a chance to travel that far, but they had enough, if you go from Southern Europe to Northern Europe, you could tell the difference, okay? So, yeah. And there were about a half dozen pretty good arguments based on observation that medieval students knew. Now, I've tested my own students over a quarter century, and it turns out that if there were a debate between medieval students and modern students, that the medieval students would win this debate. They would have more evidence for a spherical Earth than modern students, okay? So that's interesting. That is before my class. Of course, after my class, they learned better still. Yeah. Now, of course, we know a whole lot of other things they don't know, but that's because of scientific discovery since then. All right, but here's another take-home point. Shouldn't it be the case that rather than just teaching students the conclusions of majority viewpoint in science, you also should know the evidence leading up to those conclusions, and so you can evaluate them, right? Now, I know you don't have time to do that for every single topic, but at least pick out the samples along the way where you actually have to reason through from starting points, looking at evidence to drawing conclusions. So it doesn't sound like these were dark ages. Christianity held back science during the Middle Ages, according to Carl Sagan and others. Neil deGrasse Tyson perpetuates this as well. All right. Let's jump to myth 6. According to this story, Copernicus removed humans from the privileged center and thereby debunked or undermined the authority of traditional views of human significance. You know, humans being in the center of God's plan, made in His image, and so on. Okay. Now, Christopher Hitchens once said that this was Christianity's greatest failure. And according to him, the church didn't want this Copernican view because they thought it would dethrone humanity from the divine plan. And it's in the astronomy textbooks, you know, torn from its throne at the center, and so on. Now, we look at the actual history leading up to the time of Copernicus. We have to go back to Aristotle and then kind of move our way through antiquity into the Middle Ages. According to traditional scientific view of the cosmos, the universe is divided into two parts, really. There's the part under the orbit of the moon, right here, the sublunar, and then there's from the moon on up, the superlunar. And so with under the orbit of the moon, you have earth, water, air, and fire, 4 elements that come together and fall apart, and so you have corruption occurring here in the terrestrial realm. But in the celestial part of the universe, according to this view, that was the place of honor. That's the place where corruption does not happen, where all you have is perfect circular motion. So based on this historical backdrop, which was an ancient view that went all the way through the Middle Ages up to the time of Copernicus, does it sound like the center of the universe is the place of honor or dishonor? Dishonor, right? Up is exalted, the heavens, right? Down is the bottom of the universe, where things fall apart. And early Copernicans often framed this Copernican view as a promotion for Earth. Now we get to join the dance of the stars, right? And here's Galileo. He says, I will prove that the Earth does have motion, and that it is not the sump where the universe's filth and ephemera collect. You know, kind of the cesspool of the cosmos, the center, the bottom. By the way, the expression dead center, that carries the ancient and medieval view that the center was not the place of honor, the dead center, right? Yeah. So this ancient medieval view lingers in our language ever so subtly. Okay, but the modern sensibility is the center is like the center of attention, right? Or if you're self-centered, right? You have an inflated ego. Well, then that means you're not very mature or something like that, right? So, but anyway, Galileo framed this as a promotion. Kepler went even further. And let me read the quote. We could not remain at rest in the center because of that contemplation for which man was created, which includes, like I have in the diagram there, triangulating to measure distances. So once you get the triangle, you get the angles, you can figure out that if you take the distance from the sun to the earth to be 1 unit, which is today called an astronomical unit, right? Then you can calculate how far Venus is in those units. And Kepler had an early form of a designed for discovery thesis, that the universe and our place within it was designed for discovery. And this looks like a sort of a divine conspiracy to sort of draw humans into wanting to discover the world and thus to see his glory in the universe. And my colleagues at Discovery Institute, Jay Richards and Guillermo Gonzalez, a little over a decade ago, wrote a book called The Privileged Planet, in which they extended this Keplerian thesis to the nth degree. And a historian of astronomy, a colleague of mine at Notre Dame, Michael Crow, said, guys, do you know that Kepler had this basic thesis before you did? And they're going, oh, wow, that's cool. But of course, they took it, updated it with... So Kepler had a very rudimentary version of this. So this is just way cool stuff. And that's why Kepler is one of my all-time favorite scientists. Of course, besides Newton. Okay. So, by the way, this book stops with Newton, and I'm starting on my second book. Oh, no, this book stops with Kepler. My second book is probably going to start with Newton. Okay. And by the way, does this sound like a demotion here from the lips of Copernicus himself? No. And yeah. Now, continuing with that same textbook that I quoted earlier, this is a sample of how textbooks today extend the Copernican demotion story to say stuff like, well, humankind has also been relegated to an unremarkable position on the periphery of the Milky Way galaxy. Now, what's curious about this quote is in this and other textbooks like it, almost all of them discuss what's called the galactic habitable zone, which was co-discovered, by the way, by a guy named Guillermo Gonzalez, okay, who I just referred to as the co-author of Privileged Planet, right? And so Discovery Fellows, in this case, Guillermo Gonzalez, was on the cutting edge of a whole new concept that's in almost all the astronomy textbooks now. This galactic habitable zone, and it's depicted in a very rough way by the ring, okay? So in other words, you don't want to live in the inner city, bad, right? Place of death, okay? But you come out to the suburbs in just the right place, and it's actually a little more restricted to this, because you have to be between spiral arms, not just a certain distance out, but between spiral arms to get a suitable place for life. Even then, there's tons of other criteria besides that. But this galactic habitable zone, what's weird is you have this same template story, Copernican demotion, extended, more things we find, it's just another demotion for humanity. And then, like I quoted here, right? An unremarkable position on the periphery, but wait a minute, it's not unremarkable. It's part of the galactic habitable zone. There's a restricted area within which habitability is possible. So it's really interesting how these historic myths actually distort, in this case, interpretation of contemporary science. Okay? So this is not just curious historical stuff that I'm dredging up. This continues to distort the way people think today. And that's what I emphasize in my book. How bad history makes for bad thinking even today. Okay? And then my friend Tyson, I say friend loosely, Tyson, in one of his textbook forwards, he writes about, he writes about the cosmic perspective. And he actually kind of has a kind of a branding for this phrase, the cosmic perspective, okay? And this textbook actually picked up on that as its title. And so they invited him, of course, to write the foreword. And so he says, Tyson in this textbook says that this perspective says that the cosmos is not a benevolent cradle designed to nurture life, but a lonely, hazardous place. In other words, here thinking of how Lewis kind of debunked this earlier, he's kind of saying, well, because life is so rare in the cosmos, there's so many places where you can be dead, very few places where you can be alive. And he's right about that, although not he doesn't appreciate just how dozens and dozens and dozens of things have to be just right. But at least he gets some of this, and he tries to spin this as, this is not benevolent design, right? Because most of the universe is not habitable. So remember one of Lewis's options was one of these, right? It doesn't matter what option you take, the atheist is going to find something to complain about. Reminds you like of an ungrateful teenager, right? No matter how God made the universe, the teenager is going to find something to complain about, right? All right. So, and then he goes on to say that the cosmic perspective opposes the childish view that the universe, revolves around us. And again, this is the modern idea of center, right? The place of importance. And he's doing just what people did a generation or two after Galileo began to read the modern idea of center as the place of importance back in the past. But anyway, that's Tyson. And by the way, who would want to have a childish view, right? We're grown-ups, right? We want to be big boys and have science, right? Bill Nye, Tyson, right? Science, right? Back off, man, I'm a scientist. That was a bumper sticker I saw once on somebody's car. Yeah. So, yeah. And he goes on to say this was the first of many humiliations. So he has this extended Copernican demotion story. It's very popular in textbooks. In fact, it is the leading story, the leading narrative of astronomy textbooks currently in use today is this extended Copernican demotion story. And it's based on a false history. He goes on to say, and yet, kind of like Psalm 8, where David looks at the heavens and says, what is man that you are mindful of him, right? And yet, God, we were special, right? Well, Tyson has his own and yet. So as if he's sort of mimicking scripture here. H.G. Wells, if you like sci-fi, I do a little history of sci-fi in my book, and I show how Wells also, in trying to distance himself from Christianity, he actually unwittingly falls into its patterns, which is really curious. Tyson does the same thing. And yet, the cosmic perspective is spiritual. Even redemptive, but of course not religious. It's cool to be spiritual, but not religious these days, right? Okay. So, what else does he say about this brand name cosmic perspective? Well, he expresses a sense of spiritual awe, in the face of our heavenly parent, the cosmos, right? Yeah, and it redeems us from this delusion of benevolent design. We're just evolved stardust, but we know science, kind of like Bill Nye, right? But we know science, so we are special after all. And we have this spiritual sense. Yeah, we're atheists, but we have spiritual atheism, a sense of awe in the face of nature. And there's a sociologist at Rice University who's done a study on spiritual atheism, and it's really interesting. I cite that in my book as well. So so what we have here is a significance void that's left by the Copernican demotion story, and it's interesting how people just can't really leave the story there. They want to fill that void with something that would give humans a sense of significance. And part of that is, well, we know science, so I guess that makes us significant, unless you're really not into science, and then you may not feel that's very significant. I mean, I like it, but yeah. So this is this is really not an argument. It's more just sort of atheist sentimentality, kind of a sentimental feeling they have about that we're special after all, right? Okay. But this significance void is being filled with an even greater myth than just, well, even though there's no good evidence for it, that somehow intelligence could evolve from an unguided, unintelligent, process. I mean, no one has ever shown how intelligence could come from non-intelligence. But there's a new myth on the horizon, and this myth is the seventh and final myth in my book, the extraterrestrial enlightenment myth. And it's cool that E.T. has a glowing fingertip there, isn't it? For the enlightenment, right? Yeah, in case you don't know, this is Steven Spielberg. A long time ago, he made a movie, about E.T., and that's for extraterrestrial. Yeah. Now, here's a book from NASA, Your Tax Dollars at Work. And they say, yeah, Copernicus, and since then, there's been all these demotions. But, quoting the book, it's time for a promotion. How so? What the co-author here calls the undirected cosmocultural evolution, which produces intelligence, including human intelligence and, of course, alien intelligence. And this author and others are speculating that these aliens may have super intelligence and may have unlimited significance in the cosmos because they've reached sort of this intellectual nirvana. Okay. Now here's the Enlightenment myth, the E.T. Enlightenment myth. Here are the components of it. They argue that if there is an alien that arrives, we make first contact, right? First contact. here on the earth, they would have technology indistinguishable from magic. And that quote there traces back to Arthur C. Clarke, who first kind of formulated this idea. And you know him from sci-fi, particularly if you know the classic big screen movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, which is a weird, slow-moving, too slow-moving for today's students, movie. But if you have a hankering to go back and look at historical sci-fi, you got to watch it, especially for the end, because hippies in the 60s would watch this smoking pot in the movie theaters and watching the light show at the end, okay? Now you can actually do that legally, okay, in some states. So that Arthur C. Clarke, it was based on a storyline he had written. Other components of the ET Enlightenment myth, that these creatures would have highly evolved moral spiritual insights, because for them to arrive here, they'd have to have the technology and the intelligence, and through the billions of years, because morality, according to Darwin and quite a few theorists since, morality itself evolves. So they would be beyond us spiritually, because it had billions of years to tinker with different forms of spirituality until the best one rose to the surface. And it's curious that I found that in my research, it's really curious that of all religions on earth, there seems to be a kind of a special love to critique Christianity more than any other religion from this ET Enlightenment myth perspective. And it has to do, I think, especially with the idea of the incarnation, of God actually taking on human flesh on a particular planet. Okay? So you can think about that. Now, many proponents of this Enlightenment story from the heavens above also weave in an AI component, an artificial intelligence component, that maybe these creatures, when they arrive, they will be post-biological. They'll be robotic creatures. Okay, now, to go into the AI part of this, I can cite Rodney Brooks, one of the founding fathers of AI, and he critiques there's kind of two components of the AI part of this myth. There's maybe we can achieve superintelligence here on Earth through our own AI, and that's often called the singularity, when we reach that someday in the future. But what Brooks does is he critiques these wild claims of us on Earth creating superintelligence through our AI. And if it doesn't work on Earth, it's not going to work anywhere, because the same natural laws that apply here apply anywhere else in the cosmos. So that's kind of how this chapter is framed. So let's look at what Brooks says here. He says, regarding these wild claims about technological magic coming in, and many are predicting it will be in your lifetime. This will happen, okay? And his critique of this is the problem is we all have with an imagined future technology is it's far enough away from the technology that we actually know and understand that we really don't know its limitations, and it becomes indistinguishable from magic. Anything one says about it is no longer falsifiable. In other words, this techno-magic story requires a kind of a blind faith. It's not sufficiently testable. It's just you're imaginatively extrapolating into the future and say, and look, we all have the sense that computer technology is getting better and better each year, unless it's Microsoft. I'm a Mac guy, okay? It's getting better and better each year, or bloated and bloated each year, right? More and more bloated, doing useless things you don't need it to do. But whatever, it's there. And yeah. Can you imagine, the dream to finally upload yourself to have conditional immortality, and then the Microsoft screen of death comes on, and whoop, sorry, you're gone.
Spinning rainbow circle.
Yes.
Did you see your screen?
Yeah. System failure. Well, that soul just left all existence. Sorry. Okay, so you really need to keep up on your upgrades, okay? So, Brooks goes on to say, we don't really know if AGI, that is artificial general intelligence, can exist, because AGI kind of stands between us and this imagined exponential growth of artificial intelligence to become self-conscious and all that. And he goes on to say it's mostly stuck on the same issues we've known for a long time, and he says the properties are that we would need to be able to nail down are so completely unknown that rhetorically it becomes like magic, powerful without limit. So, I mean, this guy is one of the leading lights in the AI community, and he knows what he's talking about, and he's someone very useful to quote here. So he basically says that a future techno-magical, on Earth or anywhere, aliens doing this billions of years ago, right, and finally coming to Earth and showing us all their bells and whistles, this is really a faith-based argument, not a scientific argument. Now, faith, that is trust, can be reasonable, right? You can have reasonable faith, right? But it all depends on what your faith is in, right? The object of your faith. So anyway, but that's Brooks, okay? Now, how about some unreasonable faith? Let's look at Richard Dawkins. He says that there are very probably alien civilizations that are superhuman to the point of being godlike. The atheist is saying this? Yeah. Godlike in ways that exceed anything a theologian could possibly imagine. Now, this is a classic example of another club that could be on campus called unreasonable faith, okay? the evil twin of your club, okay? Okay, so now let's just imagine, you got to put your imagining caps on here, okay? Let's just imagine that one day in the future there seems to be some appearance of some super intelligent alien, maybe kind of mostly robotic looking thing. Maybe there's a little wet meat in there too, but it looks like kind of a hardware creature, super intelligent, and with magical powers, okay? Zap, Monty Python, the guy in the desert who's zapping things, right? Magical things are happening, right? I think his name was Tim, wasn't it? Yes, yeah. Who are you? Tim. Anyway, so we have this alien Tim show up, and he's zapping things and causing people to levitate and causing fire to rise up in the sky and all kinds of things that look like they're miracles, okay? Well, of course, Richard Dawkins is going to come along and say, well, of course, it's just, there's a materialistic explanation for this. It's just, advanced ET, and they finally arrived, and now we get the fireworks in the show, right? All the bells and whistles. But what's ironic is that based on their own literature, these atheists would really have no way of helping other people who may be kind of undecided whether they're going to go with the naturalistic interpretation of this creature or the supernatural interpretation. They would really have no rigorous way of distinguishing between the natural and the supernatural, which is sort of ironic for latter-day materialism to be, well, basically indistinguishable from the occult. Don't you find that just a little bit ironic? Yeah. I mean, I'm not making this stuff up. It wasn't like I'm looking at, apocalyptic literature and trying to, go to this direct. I'm reading this. Top philosophers and scientists are saying this stuff, and I'm going, oh my goodness, this is a recipe. This is unbelievable. So I wrote a book about it. So. So that's kind of the equivalent of Bill Nye the Science Guy. I suck, but I'm saying it's unbelievable. So I wrote a book about it. Okay. Now here's one of my buddies, Howard Smith at Harvard. I actually don't know him, but anyway, he's written on. I quote him profusely in my chapter because he gives some pretty good evidence against. Okay, again, you have to imagine. There's some appearance of some great creature on the planet, maybe in your lifetime, maybe not, who knows. And it looks like supernatural, but then the atheists are saying, no, it's just aliens. And Smith would come along and say, look, the evidence against the naturalistic alien interpretation of the creature would be, look, the distances between Earth and even plausibly habitable planets is so great. We've cataloged about 4,000 exoplanets up to date, right? Planets beyond our own solar system. And in the news, you'll hear every couple of years, hey, Earth-like planet. Well, they only report some of the characteristics that are Earth-like, and they don't report the dozens and dozens of other criteria that need to be met for it to really be habitable for complex life like ourselves. So our vast, and as you start calculating probabilities, you realize that you're going to have to go out a huge distance to increase your probability of getting a habitable planet. And so on. So he argues that the likelihood of aliens traveling to our planet or communicating at the speed of light, given that the speed of light is the speed limit for travel and communication, is that really we're for all practical purposes isolated. And he calls it the misanthropic principle, that we're we're lonely if you think that the material universe is all there is. We're lonely because we're just out here. And by the way, he also points out that as the universe not only expands, but accelerates in its expansion, every moment we're becoming more and more isolated from more and more of the universe in terms of communication or contact. Some of you may have never thought of that before. That Smith brings this home. So, yeah. So and I'm just giving you a little bit of his argument, but you get the idea. This is an argument. If there was apparent contact, these are the arguments that, well, maybe it's only apparent and not real. Maybe it's something else. I'll leave that to your imagination, okay? Now, turning back to, I have a database of 130 astronomy textbooks that span 4 centuries that make their way into almost all of my chapters. And it's interesting that the 2 most quoted Psalms by astronomers who wrote these textbooks over 4 centuries are Psalms 8 and 19. And the basic message that these astronomers get is something like this, that cosmic immensity shows God's power and glory, but his glory exceeds the cosmos. And we're tiny, but we're significant. Okay. Now here's Psalm 8. Right? You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babies and infants, you have established strength because of your foes to still the enemy and the avenger. Almost sounds like a good movie, huh? Well, here's the cosmic scandal here. Many astronomers, and again, most of these guys came out of a Judeo-Christian tradition framework. They thought that God used apparently insignificant persons, humanity, Israel, the Christ child, to defeat his foes. But even if humans are infants, outranked by older and wiser aliens, at least ET and Christianity could be conceived of as compatible. And I actually do the history of ideas about ET and Christianity, and it's really interesting the different ideas that people have had. For example, one medieval theologian said, well, if Jesus died on this one planet and rose from the dead, maybe it's unlikely that he would have done this millions of times, but maybe his work here would apply to other places. So there's a very interesting long history to this that I think might interest you. But not all ET scenarios are Christian friendly. And again, I cited Dawkins, and here's this guy is the professional skeptic because he founded the what society? The Skeptic Society. He's needing a little more skepticism here, folks. But anyway, here's the quote. Any sufficiently advanced extraterrestrial intelligence is indistinguishable from who? God. This is the Western world's most illustrious skeptic. And this is one of his, he calls this Schirmer's last law. Okay, yeah, so what we have here is godless philosophy mixed with science expects God-like ET. Oh my goodness. Yep, so atheism and the occult are getting harder and harder to distinguish. And this, I'm having more fun than it should be legal for a middle-aged man to be having, actually debunking this stuff and bringing this to light. I find it hilarious. So the conclusion of the first part of my talk, and my second part, by the way, is very, very brief, because we're going to leave time for Q&A. So, but the first part of my book is I debunked 7 myths, and we did 3 of them tonight, and even that just very briefly. And if you believe these myths, it would seem like science only flourishes when atheism has the upper hand. And it tends to blind us to the positive role that Christianity has in the growth of science. The second part of my book then looks at the sources and solutions for these myths, and I look particularly at Kepler as a case study for a devout Christian who was a scientist and made some amazing discoveries guided by his faith. So let me just run through a couple of those, and then I'll stop in about 5 minutes, so we'll have lots of time for Q&A. Okay, you've heard of Kepler's 3 laws of planetary motion. They're still in astronomy textbooks. The first one was, planets move in elliptical, not circular orbits. And he's got a couple other laws that give more detail. And he explained the theology that guided his discoveries. He said, I'm not like Aristotle, who didn't believe that the world was created. And so Aristotle, he couldn't really recognize these mathematical design plans for the material world, because without an architect, without a mind applying the math, instantiated it into the world, math doesn't, does a mathematical equation ever do something by itself? No. They're just there, right? But to have the mathematics in the mind of God and then applied to make the universe, that's why Christians, according to Kepler, are predisposed to expect to be able to discover mathematically elegant natural laws in the world, because math by itself is passive, but God, using math, can make a cosmos. That was his basic idea. And so he said that finding these mathematical rules for the physical world is acceptable to Christians, because we hold that God made the world by certain quantities and certain numerical relationships. And these mathematical ideas are co-eternal with them because these ideas are in the mind of God. In other words, the Pythagorean theorem and all the calculus you've ever learned, that has eternally been in the mind of God. We humans just discovered it. Now we invented notation and so on, obviously, but that's part of our creativity as image bearers, according to Kepler. All right? So math exists in the mind of God. God selects some of those mathematical principles to instantiate into a physical world, and then scientists later discover them. And Kepler said that in doing so, we share in his own thoughts. And this is often paraphrased as thinking God's thoughts after him. Kepler actually never said that I can find, but this is what he actually said. Basically the same thing. Yeah. Because I found that quote zillions of times, and no one ever cites where it really comes from. So finally figured, he actually never said that. It was someone's summary of it. So God is free, according to Kepler, to make many kinds of universes. And he might have made other universes, but at least we know he's free in making this one. And so we can't just know in advance or deduce from first principles how he must have created, because that would limit divine freedom. Now, this kind of theology, often called voluntarism, emphasizing God's free choice in making this universe this particular way, but he could have made it another way, actually helps undergird a very important scientific procedure called testing multiple hypotheses. I mean, Kepler didn't just come up with the ellipse right away. He tried different closed curve figures beyond the circle and eventually found that the ellipse best fit the latest data. So this is a good example where Christian theology helped to actually support the importance of testing multiple competing hypotheses in science, which is critical to science, isn't it? So faith coming first in God, and then reasoning coming later. And here's another example of the influence of Christianity through Kepler on science. He quotes Psalm 102, which says that the heavens will wear out like a garment. Now, most of you are not old to realize this, but clothing does actually wear out over time. Okay, and so from Kepler's day, others would cite this psalm with him and say, what was the traditional Greek view? That the heavens are what? Incorruptible, right? And that here you have a Bible verse that didn't sort of really fit that ancient scientific view. But now with early modern scientists discovering supernovae, although they didn't know what they were, but new stars as they called them, right? There were changes in the heavens, and Kepler noted how that was consistent with Scripture. Yep. So just a few talking points here about the relationship between Bible and certain scientific ideas in the early modern period that might interest you. Okay, so lessons learned. All the 7 myths that we kind of highlighted, a few of them, the basic story is science is inconsistent with Christianity or religion, but particularly Christianity is beat up more than any other religion, which is really odd because of all religions, Christianity has the best track record of actually cultivating science, right? So, yeah, go beat up on someone else, right? No, don't beat up on any religion. So anyway, so in terms of this argument, I'm not saying all religions are equally valid. I'm just saying, do your homework before you start bad-mouthing a religion about whether they're science-friendly or not. I mean, they might be science-friendly, or they might not be, but do your homework. Find out what's the case, right? So his theology actually guided discovery. So here's my last slide, and we'll go to Q&A. And yeah, if you want to later go find the book, you can get it as cheap as $10 for iBooks or a Kindle, okay? And just go to unbelievablemyths.com, and it kicks you right to Amazon. But anyway, so my story is this. There's 6 historic myths that left a significance void. That void is now being filled by the ET myth, the 7th myth. That myth, based on materialism or atheism, actually erodes discernment. You no longer have the ability to really distinguish between natural and supernatural anymore, right? Wasn't that the point I was making? Okay. In contrast, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, who believed in God, belief in a maximally rational lawgiver leads you to expect you can actually go out and discover these mathematically beautiful rules about the world. That supports rationality. But you know, Christians and Jews are happy to share the scientific tradition with the rest of the world. You know, we're happy that, yes, the Judeo-Christian tradition nurtured science in many important ways, but whether you're an agnostic or an atheist, we're happy to share science with you. So join the club, okay? Thank you for having me. You've got questions, we've got answers. That's how Radio Shack answered the phone before they went out of business.
No one ever wants to ask the first question, so let's skip to the second one.
Yeah, what do you got here?
All right, I got a series of questions. I'll just shoot them at you as fast as I can. You're a historian of science. What's the influence of the movie Inherit the Wind on culture with science and religion? Have you looked at any research on that?
Yeah, that's the movie based on the play, based on the historical event of the Scopes trial, the monkey trial, where William Jennings Bryan was trying to, well, the people in...
Prosecuting attorney.
Yeah. So
Scopes, the teacher.
Right.
Defended by Clarence Darrow.
Yeah. So what happened is the actual trial was an embarrassment to Christianity to some extent because of the way that was handled. But the movie, or the play, and then the movie based on it, exaggerated that several times to make Christianity even look more ridiculous. So that's basically what happened. Back then, the ACLU was in favor of free speech. You ought to teach not just criticisms of Darwin, but also its strengths. Now, guess what the ACLU is doing? Just the opposite. No more free speech on this topic, only the arguments for Darwinism, which is ironic, isn't it? So much for the ACLU. It's a liberal, down-your-throat think tank now, not really for free speech anymore. Obviously, they support free speech in some areas, but not in this area. Yeah, next question.
I got a whole series.
Okay, well, let's do one more, and then we'll come back around to you.
Geocentric view, did they think hell was at the center of Earth in the Middle Ages?
Well, Dante
I know Dante
depicted hell as if it were in the center of the earth. Because look, given ancient and medieval cosmology, it kind of made sense. Because if Satan is going to fall, what's the furthest he could fall to? Well, that would be the center of the earth, right? But it's curious that at that time, the center of the earth was not considered a hot place, but a cold place, which makes sense in terms of ancient cosmology, because fire goes up, right? And the colder elements go down. No, of course, scriptural metaphors for hell are hot and fiery. But of course, there is one scriptural metaphor for hell. It's in the book of Jude, which is the only time the word planetos is used in the New Testament for planet, where heretics are compared to planets that sort of spin out into outer darkness to a cold place, okay? So that would be a cold metaphor for hell. But the bottom line is hell is a real place. Various metaphors are used for it, whether it's hot or cold or lonely or whatever. So I added more to your question than you probably wanted, but I thought that was kind of fun to add anyway. A little bit of the history of the idea of hell. Yes?
So you used a lot of quotes in your presentations. Do you cite these quotes when you use them in your book?
Oh, yes, I do. Yeah. I have about 2.5 footnotes per page.
Awesome.
Yeah. And there's 200 pages, so yeah. Lots of footnotes. And so, yeah, if you're writing term papers, you got my entire, trail of tears. Yeah. They're up here.
So what did happen to Copernicus if not the traditional story?
Well, he worked for the Catholic Church. He dedicated his book to the Pope, and he died the day it was published. I'm not dead, so I guess I'm ahead of him, right? My book just came out. But he died of natural causes. He wasn't poisoned by the Kremlin or by the Vatican, okay? And as far as we know, natural causes. Yeah, so there was the controversy over Copernicus really was the next generation, so during the time of Galileo, and that story there was conflict between Galileo and the church, but it was between Galileo and a faction within the church, the major faction, but there was also a pro-Galileo faction within the church, and furthermore, Galileo, it wasn't science versus religion because the majority of scientists were against Galileo. Right? So that whole story gets blown way out of proportion. But it was embarrassing for the Catholic Church, no doubt. And they were guilty of overreach because it was during the Counter-Reformation. They were a little hypersensitive because of those Protestants, right? Yeah. But anyway, I have a whole chapter on that. Yeah. Saw a hand. Yes, right there.
So one of the early heresies of first century Christianity kind of took a while to be covered down was the whole dualism idea.
By the way, can we have some light in here? More light?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're not going to slide anymore.
Yeah. Okay.
That Christ could not have been both divine and man because matter was inherently evil and spirit was inherently good, kind of thing.
Yeah. Early Gnosticism. Yeah.
And that was Aristotle's influence, and the Greek philosophers kind of came in and influenced Christianity, but part of what they came from. The mainstream Christianity kind of got that under control, but it sounds like that idea kind of continued to haunt the scenes, and it was only after in the Middle Ages that started to finally be explained away through the idea of science. And it seems like there's an irony that back in the Renaissance, they look back to the classicists and they start going back to the philosophers as a way of trying to get away from the spiritual. Is that kind of the right?
Yeah. Well. Yeah, I think that. The early church, even in the New Testament, confronts an incipient form of Gnosticism. It took a while for Gnosticism really to grow to become a full-fledged heresy. But that matter is inherently evil, and that's bad news because the incarnation, that would make Jesus inherently evil, right? So Christians, effectively argued against that. But how would it affect science? Science studying the material world, right? Well, St. Augustine, who I quote, he writes, that you should appeal to reason and experience to make sense of God's world, and this is going to be consistent with God's book, the Bible. So God authored 2 books. This 2 books metaphor was very popular through the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. And so if God is the author of the book of nature and the book of Scripture both, then once both books are properly interpreted, they're not going to what? Contradict or conflict. But the key is proper interpretation of both. And you could easily misinterpret one or the other, and then you would have an apparent conflict, wouldn't you? Now, it's only a real conflict if they're both properly interpreted. So the book of nature is not evil, inherently evil. It's the mind of God made matter and gave it mathematical rules, so it's good. Now it's fallen, of course, now, but it's good. So I think that studying a little bit of the history of science and theology can, like in this book here, can help make sense of why Gnosticism really never got, how it was effectively beaten back. But it keeps rearing its ugly head now. These old heresies kind of reappear at different times in church history and in slightly new forms. Over this way, yes.
I have more of a general question about science and miracles in the Bible.
Yeah.
For example, the crossing of the Red Sea, Jesus raising somebody from the dead, like Lazarus, feeding the 5,000. I'd be interested to hear what your opinion is about God's role in that as being breaking the laws that He created for His own divine purpose, or whether He just used natural laws that were already pre-existing and He just implemented them.
Yeah. So the questions about miracles. By the way, my favorite book on miracles is a C.S. Lewis book called Miracles. Yeah. So so I would go there, but it's like this. I'm in the habit of eating certain things before I go to bed. Certain kinds of food because I'm hypoglycemic. I don't want to wake up in the middle of the night. But occasionally, for various reasons, I might eat something else. Did I break the law of granola that I usually eat? No, I just chose to do otherwise. So many theologians have thought of natural laws as the way God usually manages the universe. But sometimes for special reasons, particularly for signs, to indicate something special, you'll look at, if you look at, the Germans call it, nature history and salvation history, Geistgeschichte. Salvation history is the history of God's special acts. That, so the major prophets, especially when Christ came, an explosion of miraculous activity to indicate who he was, particularly his resurrection, the consummate miracle, which left a historical trail of evidence. So, the two, look, you would not even recognize the miracle had there not been a backdrop of regularity against which the miracle stands out, right? So miracle and natural law are not at odds with each other. The very idea of miracle requires a background of regularity to even be recognizable, right? So they're not in conflict. It's like two sides of the coin, right? So, and Lewis does a great job of doing this. So
Miracles or science, it's both.
yeah, some of the Old Testament miracles that you cited, yeah, I mean that's where natural laws can't be used to explain that. Now, but when it comes to something like the Star of Bethlehem, it's a little more murky, like, okay, was it certain alignments of planets that were interpreted? Because some of the language is unclear, whether it was a natural or supernatural event. But regardless, it clearly marked the birth of the Christ child. And even Babylonian astronomers apparently recognized this as something significant happening in the land of Israel and followed that. It might have been a combination of natural and supernatural in that case, the so-called Star of Bethlehem. Yeah. And Kepler had a theory about this, by the way, and numerous scientists throughout history have had theories about what that was. So, yeah, back this way. Yes, right here.
So you mentioned the mathematics that could be found throughout the laws of the natural world. I remember, the name slips my mind now, but there was this one researcher who mentioned that there's also like a mathematical pattern to Scripture. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, there are various theories that go back to Hebrew letters representing numbers. There's all the Bible code type stuff, and I'm not real hip on that stuff. I don't think there's a whole lot. I mean, some of it maybe, some of it's not. So, but I haven't really done the detailed homework to really weigh in on that topic. So I'm punting on that one. Next question. My general answer is I'm a little skeptical of some of those. Yeah. Behind you? Right? No? Okay. Next question. Yes.
Hi. You mentioned once about Michael Shermer's quote about not being able to distinguish sufficiently intelligent, like aliens, from God.
Oh, or from supernatural creatures.
There you go.
Maybe not God, maybe some other supernatural creatures.
Right.
Not so friendly, yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering how we can distinguish the difference between anything supernatural and what's natural.
Yeah, good question. Well, that kind of goes back to the miracle and natural law thing, exactly. So this is good to kind of pool these questions. They're connected to each other. So well-timed questions, but yeah. Well, like I said, I quoted Kepler as one who recognized that when the universe is the result of really speech acts of God. And that's how the narrative reads. God said, and it was, and it was, and it was. So there you have the greatest, not just a super intelligence, but the greatest, look, when Dawkins says E.T. will be greater than what theologians have ever conceived, is he ignorant of centuries of reflection on God as that being greater than which nothing can be even conceived? Greater? Boethius in the late antiquity. So God as the greatest conceivable being, or you could frame it the other way I just did, think of the most exquisite mathematics. How far did you go up? Differential equations? I don't know how far you up in mathematics, but think of all the beauty and intricacy of mathematics, and then how a lot of that works in natural law and understanding physical theory. Not all mathematics applies to nature, of course. We know there's a lot of, like imaginary numbers don't apply, things like that. But they're cool for math, but they just don't work for physics unless you're really desperate as an atheist and grasping for something that you need that for. But yeah, so natural laws are expression, and in fact, in the Psalms in the Bible, the regularity of nature is an expression of the faithfulness of God. That's a regular theme in the book of Psalms. If you read through the book of Psalms with this in your mind, you'll probably find dozens of instances of this. So that's an indication, or it's an expression of God's faithfulness, that he's upholding the universe in a consistent way. It's kind of like a covenant with creation. He had the covenant with Israel as a nation, but he had a covenant with creation, and it's an expression of his faithfulness. So there's actually a deep theology behind this. Then what is the role and the significance of the exceptions to the rule? Well, that would be where God is doing something different for the sake of a sign. A sign indicates something. It's kind of like if you have a room that's my rooms are pretty clean and crisp, right? If I'm about to fall asleep and I want to remember something in the morning, I'll throw something out in the middle of my floor and I'll say, okay, remember such and such. And the next morning I wake up, I see the object, it's out of place, and immediately I remember what I had to, okay? It works for me. But if your room is totally cluttered, it's not going to work because it won't stand out, right, as special. So if the world was totally chaos with no natural laws, just totally unpredictable, you could walk through a wall one day and the next day you would bump into it and stuff like that, then miracles, the very idea of miracle wouldn't even make sense. So the two are a part of God's plan, and many scientists understood this, that in their vocation as scientists, they were discovering not salvation history, they were discovering God's general providence, if you will. And so the two are complementary, and many scientists recognize this, and so I think that's a good story that needs to be told. Yeah, that science and Christianity are friends. Yeah, buddies. Yeah, Becca.
First of all, thank God who exists for your book, the God who is. Second, you spoke about the pre-modern worldview, and you just mentioned something about the centuries reflection that they're obviously unaware of, the skeptics.
Yeah, about God as the greatest conceivable being. Yeah.
Yes, but I think we all find that a lot of believers are also ignorant of those things.
That's true. Yeah.
We're taken in by modernism,
right?
The Enlightenment and all that stuff, and we don't know the reflection on these things. Can you speak to how that the knowledge of those things, exposing ourselves to that stuff, and helping other people hear about it, and reading books like yours, and then taking the footnotes and reading those books, could help us not get snookered or taken in by these myths?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm just getting started on this. I'm not just thinking I'm an author now and I'm writing, but I mean, I'm just thinking I'd like to do this forever, actually. Continue to study the ways of God, the way He manages the cosmos, and even the new heavens and the new earth. Christianity needs to reinfuse into the young people the excitement of the life of the mind, and picking out great figures of the past like Kepler and Newton and Galileo, and just reading biographies of these people and becoming to awaken the imagination of what a Christian mind can do for the glory of God. That I think should be an important part of education in the home, in Christian schools, and in clubs like this. I know it's being done on secular campuses. So, yeah, and when you see the history, Christians started the first public hospitals. Christians started the university. Christians started a lot of great things. And atheists today are living off of borrowed cultural capital from the Judeo-Christian tradition that often they don't appreciate. And often Christians don't appreciate that. So, yes, we need to get the message out. So that's why clubs like this are important, because we need to have not unreasonable faith. Yeah, back here.
What is your view on scholasticism?
Scholasticism? Yes. That's the term that refers to the educational sort of method, especially associated with Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages and the universities. And there was often it's bad mouth as being backward compared to some of the innovations after that. And yeah, but look, what the universities did do is they cultivated a culture of disputation, where students had to argue pro and con all kinds of subjects in theology, in physics, in astronomy, and that sharpened their reasoning skills. So and Aquinas was, of course, Thomas Aquinas was trying to reconcile a lot of the Aristotelian stuff that finally got translated fully into Latin, or mostly, and that with Christianity, and that was an important intellectual exercise. So, and Rodney Stark, who's published a number of books on this, he's kind of my counterpart. He does more broadly culture, a little bit on science, but I'm honing in just on science and culture, and taking it a little bit beyond where he took it. He shows how Christianity has been good for so many aspects of culture. So I'm saying, yeah, let's do that, man. Get the word out. Yeah.
So towards the end, you were talking about how Kepler was seeing mathematics as a way to understand the world. One of the main secular ideas is that math is a construction of the mind.
Math is a what?
Math is something that humans have made up.
Right, construction, right. Right, yeah.
What are your thoughts about that?
It's both. For example, Newton had his calculus notation and Leibniz had his. They both co-invented the calculus. Guess whose notation won out? Nope, Leibniz. Newton was kind of weird. His notation was kind of awkward. Leibniz was the one that really took the day. So those were two different notations that were invented by human minds. But they were notations for basic mathematical structures that I argue exist eternally in the mind of God. So there's both discovery and invention in mathematics. Discovery of beautiful ideas from the mind of God, and because we're made in the image of God, we have the limited ability to do that, of course, given appropriate cultivation and education to get to that, to be able to cultivate your mind, to be able to think God's thoughts, if you will. Yeah. So it's really, I think, I find this so devotionally illuminating and stimulating the life of the mind, because you're honoring God with your mind by thinking His thoughts after Him. And it's just fabulous. And we stand on the shoulders of giants like Kepler and Newton and Galileo in doing so. Yeah?
And then one follow-up question. So in that case, how do you distinguish between what is like a coincidence between a math model and the world versus something that's inherently embedded within our universe?
Testing. Multiple testing and multiple labs testing it and so on. Yeah, that's what... Remember I said that another Christian theological idea that promoted testing is God could have made the world in many different ways. And so you can't just deduce one way He had to do it. And He could have used, did gravity have to be, exactly the way it is? I know, okay, when it comes to fine-tuning arguments, once you have, if you think kind of imagining God, imagining the world before He actually made it, He had lots of options, but once you start to make the world in certain ways, there are other things in the world that are going to have to be coordinated with that, and that's part of the fine-tuning thing. But if you step back even behind that, from scratch, which only God can do, right? Starting from scratch, literally no space, time, and matter, right? Well, then there's options that are just beyond our mind's ability to conceive. So that's why we need to test. And that theological perspective actually promotes scientific testing. So again, Christian theology has been good for culture, particularly scientific culture.
Because there was some Greek thought was that we don't have to test. We expect these to be perfect spheres, things like that.
Exactly. And Kepler, remember, he was contrasting his view with Aristotle, the ancient pagan views. Very self-conscious, saying we're not like them. This is why we think the way we think. Yeah, good to chime in there. The guy that taught my course for one semester, yeah. Okay, yeah.
What is your thought on pre-Victorian censorship?
On what censorship?
Pre-Victorian censorship.
Pre-Victorian?
Yes, sir.
That is before the Victorian era.
Yes, sir.
Well, censorship has come and gone.
Censorship within science, you're talking about, or?
Just the broad field.
Yeah, censorship, different. It's not just in the West. You look at censorship across cultures. People who are in power that want to control ideas, and sometimes it's, Victorian. You think, British, fairly recent history. So this is fairly recent stuff. I'm not sure. Do you have any examples in mind, or? But in general, censorship bad. Yeah.
Galileo's time.
What?
Galileo's time.
Oh, okay. So that would be way before Victorian. So yeah, So there was the majority of leadership within the Catholic Church did end up censoring Galileo, and they have been embarrassed about it ever since. So yeah, there's an example of apparent conflict between science and religion. But as I mentioned earlier, Galileo had his friends in the church. And if you read my chapter on it, there's all kinds of ways that this could have turned out otherwise. If Galileo had been more modest, a little more patient, and more tactful with people, it might not have blown up in his face. But the church had its problem. The Catholic Church, the majority of leadership had its problems too. So everybody ended up with egg on their face in that one. Yeah. But it wasn't as bad as it's often made out to be. There wasn't any essential conflict between monolithic science and monolithic religion. There was various factions within science, various factions within theology, as there are today, right? You have to kind of hash it out. And eventually, these things, within a few generations, these things all got worked out. Although the Catholic Church has to still live with the embarrassing incident. So, yeah. Yeah.
My understanding of that is from Donna Sobel's book, Galileo's Daughter.
Yeah.
It basically tells the story that Galileo's science was fine. It was the fact that he insulted the Pope by making him into the fool in his book. So it's really an interpersonal conflict between him and the Pope. If he would have been a former friend, then he'd have to live in a relationship. Is that kind of what you found?
That was part of the story, yeah. So she's got a good take on that, yeah. Okay, we're still got a little more time?
Along those lines, can you comment on how Kepler, who overlapped in time with Galileo, didn't face opposition for views about, the Earth going around the sun and so forth?
Right, yeah, good counterpoint. So we focus so much on Galileo in that period of censorship. We forget about Kepler operated fairly freely when he was in Protestant lands. I mean, he was in a Catholic area for a while. He got kicked out of there. But when he was among fellow Protestants, it was like, he could basically say mostly what he wanted to say, and it was fine. So, yeah. So that was looking at broader history. So good to kind of follow up on your thoughts. Yeah. Yes?
It was Kepler who published right around when he died?
Kepler, he was publishing and he was still living while he was publishing. Yeah, it was Copernicus that died on his,
Was that intentional on his part? Like, did he publish when he thought he was going to die because he was scared of pushback?
I don't think so. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I've actually heard that was intentional, but maybe.
Copernicus, wanting to die when he was.
Some people have speculated that, but.
Oh, okay.
I mean, maybe.
That wasn't my question.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
So you said that Copernicus tried other closed, curved shapes aside from a circle.
Kepler did. Kepler would be a second-generation Copernican. Yeah. So he's developing the Copernican theory further.
What other shapes did he try besides circles?
Kind of an egg-shaped one. So an ellipse is symmetrical, but an ovoid is asymmetrical this way. So he tried those. They didn't quite fit. Okay. Yeah, a few other kind of less-known closed curve figures. Yeah. Yes, we'll hear. Yep.
We've kind of established here that science and faith, true faith, I guess, are not in conflict.
Right, and more than just not in conflict, but with Kepler as an example, Christian faith has been really important for the growth of science. Yeah.
I guess what I'm wondering is, it seems like, could you say the same? You got the issue of science fiction, and it seems like most science fiction is predicated upon these concepts of AI or aliens or some power that they are trying to replace God. Is there a problem and conflict inherently there for you?
Well, it's interesting. One of the founding fathers of science fiction, Johannes Kepler. And he used science fiction as a way, he said, imagine you take a trip to the moon and you got some of the physics right of traveling to the moon. And then if you're on the moon, it's going to seem like it's at rest. And so he actually gives a Copernican argument by imaginatively putting you like you're an alien on the moon looking at the Earth. And he gives a Copernican argument in that way. So it was a pro-scientific, pro-Copernican science fiction. And so sci-fi can be used for good, or there's the good side and the dark side of science fiction. Exactly, his space trilogy, and the last of which, that Hideous Strength, he anticipates some of what I call the E.T. Enlightenment myth. This guy is scary prophetic about several things. And again, if you like Lewis, you'll like my book. Yes?
Speaking of Lewis, you mentioned that you kind of a lot in your book. I'm a little confused about the quote and your point regarding what was mentioned here, the Aristotelian pushback on Aristotle.
Yeah.
And the quote there does not seem to make room for what I perceived in Lewis and others, that the pagans, the Greeks
Yep.
got kind of close with their God of the philosophers. So was Aristotle way that far?
No, I mean, in some respect, I mean, Aristotle and Plato believed in intelligent design. They had a kind of a proto-intelligent design theory, but they thought that the intelligence was inherent to the universe and not transcendent.
Sounds like he was making a black and white dichotomy there from that tiny quote. So.
Well, yeah, this is Kepler contrasting his view with Aristotle's with respect to certain issues, but there are a lot of other issues you could look at where there would be more in common. Yeah. Yeah. Yes?
Is the Force good or evil? From Star Wars.
Depends on which side you're on. Last question right here.
Are you familiar with Descartes' version of his theology or his view of the absolute God?
Yeah, so René Descartes, who lived kind of Galileo, Newton time, kind of in the middle there, he was French Catholic guy, and he thought about how God might have made the universe, and he first, he doubted his own existence and all that, but he figured out that at least he exists and that God exists and the material world's got to exist. And he kind of reasoned his way, well, how does the material world exist? And he thought that gravity was really just swirls of matter called vortex. But Newton was able to disprove that. So the vortex theory collapsed after Newton came along. But Newton's ideas were criticized because it was like, you've got gravity, but it's almost like, action at a distance. That seems kind of spooky, weird, But hey, we got quantum mechanics now. It's even weirder, right? So no big deal. All right, I think that's it.
Out of time. Thank you.
Yeah.